All right, everyone, we are back with another episode of the Kyle Anzalone Show. A lot of important stuff to talk about today. Before I get into it, I want to remind people that if you are watching on X, to head on over to the YouTube channel, subscribe, and then you could comment, let us know what you think, recommend future guests for the show. Today, it's just going to be me. We've had some great guests on the past few weeks, and I'm excited to have some more on in the weeks to come. If you are listening on X, repost the show, help us get it out there to a few more people. Now, want to start off on today's show talking about Trump made some interesting statements over the weekend, and let's break those down and start to get into them. So let's play the first clip.
Just hours ago, President Trump called me to tell me he is, quote, pissed off with Russia's President Putin and threatened to impose secondary tariffs on Russia's oil. Quote, if Russia and I are unable to make a deal on stopping the bloodshed in Ukraine, and if I think it was Russia's fault, which it might not be, but if I think it was Russia's fault, I am going to put secondary tariffs on all oil coming out of Russia. Mr. Trump said 25% tariffs on Russian oil could happen any moment and told me he plans to speak with President Putin this week. The president told me, quote, I was very angry, pissed off when Putin started getting into Zelensky's credibility and started talking about new leadership in Ukraine.
So I think this is a really interesting moment in the early negotiations to end the war in Ukraine, because I think we are still in the very early phase of these negotiations. But up until this point, Trump has done what I think was a good job in a smart way to approach things by, rather than trying to be antagonistic towards Russia to confront Vladimir Putin, rather to just say, I think this is somebody I could get along with. This is somebody we can negotiate with. Unlike Joe Biden, he's not constantly comparing him to Hitler and calling him a dictator. This is important if we want to get diplomacy done. However, I think over the past week, Trump is maybe a little upset with how Putin is negotiating. Last week, the U.S. helped to broker an agreement to end attacks on energy infrastructure in Ukraine and Russia. So that's a step in the right direction. And also to implement the Black Sea Initiative. I think once that was agreed to, Russia then came to the U.S. and said, now we need sanctions relief so Russian ships can export through the Black Sea Grain Initiative. And I think maybe Trump was not too happy with Vladimir Putin for doing this. And we actually have a full screen. Let's put up my first article here. And this one is titled, Russia says negotiations with U.S. on Black Sea ongoing. And I think Russia's playing a little bit of hardball with Trump here. And these statements are Trump essentially trying to be an alpha male. He wants to be the top dog. And so he's barking back at Putin a little bit. I also think he's trying to draw a red line for Putin, saying like, you know, you can make demands, but you can't demand regime change in Kiev. And if that's going to be one of Trump's red lines, then that may be the case. Now, let's play this clip of Vladimir Putin where he's talking about and making some of the statements that seem to have upset Trump.
The current civil authorities in Ukraine have no legitimacy in accordance with the country's constitution. Ukraine has held no presidential election, while according to the constitution, all key officials are to be appointed by the president, including regional government bodies, governors, and so on. So, if the president is illegitimate, so are all the others. So, under these circumstances of de facto illegitimacy, neo-Nazi formations receive additional weapons and recruit new personnel. What does this lead to? What could it lead to? It results in de facto power being in their hands. This, in turn, means that it is already unclear with whom to sign documents and what effect such documents might carry. For tomorrow, new leaders may come to power through elections and declare, "We do not know who signed those papers, so goodbye." The issue is not just this uncertainty, it is that these neo-Nazi formations, such as Azov, among others, are effectively beginning to run the country. This raises the question, how is it possible to conduct negotiations with them? In such situations, international practice follows a well-established path. Within the framework of the United Nations peacekeeping operations, there have been several cases of what is termed external governance or temporary administration. This occurred in East Timor, I believe in 1999, in parts of the former Yugoslavia, and in New Guinea. In short, such precedents exist.
So, as one of the commenters said on the YouTube page, Putin is in the driver's seat and Trump doesn't like that. I kind of agree that that's how Trump feels about things and also how Putin feels about things, given this statement. Now, in a sense, I understand Putin's remarks here on the questions of Zelensky's legitimacy. After all, if Russia invests significant time, they make concessions to come to an agreement with the Zelensky led government in Kiev. And once that agreement is agreed to, the Ukrainians just don't implement it. And we've seen this in the past. In 2019, the Russia and Ukraine, along with France and Germany, were trying to implement the Minsk Accords and bring an end to the civil war in Ukraine and ensuring the Donbass's autonomy and safety. And it would no longer be a breakaway region. It would still be a part of Ukraine. And they were working on implementing this. And Zelensky went to the front lines and talked to the Ukrainian nationalist fighters, some of them neo-Nazis, and demanded that they step away, that they end the fighting, that they withdraw to implement this ceasefire. And they laughed at him. They said they wouldn't do it. There's a really good article by Alexander Rubinstein and Matt Blumenthal about this at the Gray Zone, which if you're unfamiliar, you should really check it out and read it. And in that article, they just describe how Zelensky lacked the authority to actually implement the ceasefire that Ukraine had agreed to, and this attempt to end the, at that time, Ukraine civil war. And so I think that's a fair question for Vladimir Putin to ask. However, asserting that Ukraine is going to hold elections that Russia demands doesn't seem like something that's actually going to facilitate any kind of peace deal. And this really, I think, puts Putin in a real pickle here, where, and I've said this throughout the war, where by invading Ukraine, he's kind of sealed Zelensky's fate, where he's never going to be the leader in Ukraine post war. But at the same time, is Putin ever going to have anybody more reasonable to negotiate with than Zelensky? If the Ukrainian people get to go out and vote at this point, how hard right, how nationalist is that government going to be? And so I do think at the end of the day, Zelensky is kind of forced to negotiate with, or Putin is forced to negotiate with Zelensky. That's the best partner he's going to have to try to end this war, and just hope, I guess, that Donald Trump is willing to give him some support to make sure that he doesn't get killed by the Ukrainian nationalists, is able to implement whatever agreement. Of course, now Washington has a lot more leverage over the Ukrainian military with all the support that we give. So Donald Trump could certainly help implement any kind of deal. So Donald Trump appeared, I don't want to say to walk back his initial remarks that MSNBC's Meet the Press Kristen Welker reported on, but he did have a much softer tone when he was actually speaking directly with the press. So let's move on to the next clip.
Known him for a long time. We've always gotten along well, despite the Russia hoax. It's a hoax created by Clinton and Schiff and all of these lunatics. And that really was a dangerous point. That was a very dangerous thing they did to this country. It was a pure, unadulterated scam, hoax. But no, I think he'll be okay. But if he isn't, I was disappointed in a certain way. Some of the things that were said over the last day or two having to do with Zelensky, because when he considers Zelensky not credible, he's supposed to be making a deal with him, whether you like him or you don't like him. So I wasn't happy with that, but I think he's going to be good.
So this is, I think, a much more reasonable statement for Trump to make. He is trying to draw a red line here, saying, Putin can't demand regime change in Kiev, and saying that this is the person that you are going to negotiate with. And he keeps repeating this idea of secondary tariffs, he calls them. Really, what he's talking about is secondary sanctions, which would mean any country that violates U.S. sanctions on Russia would then be sanctioned themselves. I largely think that this is an empty threat at this point, and largely Russia has circumvented the U.S. sanctions, and this isn't going to, it's either going to hurt U.S. allies too much to actually implement, or if he does implement it to the degree that he's able to without drastically harming Western economies and the U.S. economy, it's not going to make a very big difference. Now, along with threatening Putin this weekend. Trump also had some harsh words for Iran. Let's play the next clip.
On Iran, the president said he's also considering secondary tariffs if Iran doesn't agree to a nuclear deal. Quote, if they don't make a deal, there will be bombing, and it will be bombing the likes of which they have never seen before.
So this is just, such a Trumpian threat, right? Where he's saying, oh, the lights of which you never seen before. I don't really think Trump is going to go to war with Iran, but I think these statements are incredibly, incredibly unhelpful when it comes to the war in any negotiations with Iran and getting any kind of deal done. And so this is really a step in the wrong direction. And of course, he's making all these threats. He's bombing Yemen. He's bombing Somalia all the time. He's backing what Israel is doing in Gaza. And he has his director of national intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, continuing to just say amazing and nice things about Donald Trump is the peace president. He is the furthest thing from a peace president. And of course, Tulsi Gabbard has to know this. She opposed so much of the war state when she was a member of Congress and when she was running for president. And her sudden reversal on this is just so embarrassing. And I think it really sends a bad signal that we may not get a more reasonable Trump administration than a Biden administration when you don't even have Tulsi Gabbard seeming to stand up against the worst things that the Trump administration is doing. So now let's get to Signalgate. This is still the news of the day everywhere. And of course, most of the news is focused on, I think, really the least important part of the scandal, and that is was this classified information? And more important parts are, should maybe Mike Waltz be fired? What was Mike Waltz's relationship with Jeffrey Goldberg? But in my view, the most important part of all of this is the war in Yemen and just how flippant it was that they decided to come to this war in Yemen and that they started this bombing campaign. And so let's start with our next clip. This is General McKenzie talking about the Trump's bombing campaign in Yemen.
Well, now we're beginning to do it, and we're beginning to strike effectively at a pace, a scope, and a tempo that frankly eluded the last administration. And I would argue that we're doing it because for the first time, we have the political will to employ appropriate military capability against the Houthis. And we want one of two things from the Houthis. We want them either to be deterred from attacking ships that pass through the Bab el-Mandeb, which really means the Suez Canal. That's one condition. The other condition would be if they won't stop, we want to remove their capability to do it. The second task would be harder. It is within our capability. It will not be a short action. It won't be what we'd call a single period of darkness. These attacks will have to continue. They may grow in scope and scale. They're certainly not endless in time, and we need to fix the problem and move on to other things.
So, just so much of what he says there, so telling about the Pentagon, about Washington's thinking on these conflicts, where you have this retired general saying that it's good that Trump is ramping up the bombing campaign in Yemen. We have to restore order there. This is going to be this is going to be a drawn out bombing campaign, but then we're going to fix the problem and move on. Of course, you can't bomb your way to solving problems around the world. This is not the way it's going to work. What happens if the U.S. just dislodges the Houthis in Yemen? Well, the next strongest group in Yemen is Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. And so do we really want to create another Al-Qaeda state after we've already done that in Syria? This is absolute lunacy. The idea that we could bomb our way to success in Yemen, that this is going to achieve something. We've been trying it for a decade now. First, 2015 to 2022, backing Saudi Arabia. They were absolutely ruthless. They were bombing the farms, cholera treatment facilities, hospitals, grain facilities. They had a blockade over the country. The people were starving to death. At the time, it was the worst humanitarian crisis in the world. And of course, now that's been replaced by like Gaza and Sudan because the situation has become so much worse there. And Yemen had a few years of relative reprieve from 2022 to 2024. But Biden started bombing weekly bombings of that country, multiple bombs at the time. At the time, the U.S. Navy was describing it as their most significant military engagement, naval engagement since World War II. And so there's this pretending that Joe Biden, and I guess it's just because it wasn't in the news every day during the Biden administration, that Biden didn't take a firm hand in Yemen, that Biden wasn't trying to bomb the Houthis off the map. This wasn't the case. Biden was very aggressive in Yemen. He bombed the country time after time after time and helped the Israelis to bomb Yemen several times, including massive strikes on the Port of Hadida and on energy facilities in Yemen. And the reason this is happening is because the Houthis, Ansar Allah, who rule Yemen, are trying to stand up for the Palestinians. And this could all be stopped, as we have seen previously. Whenever there was a ceasefire in Gaza, the Houthis weren't attacking shipping. And initially, they were just attacking Israeli-linked shipping. They weren't even attacking U.S. shipping, because this wasn't about the U.S. until the U.S. started bombing Yemen. And that's what we again have here, where the Houthis weren't attacking U.S. ships, U.S. warships. They weren't launching missiles at Israel, but Israel then blockaded Gaza. They started to bomb and kill hundreds and hundreds of people in Gaza, 200-300 children over the past week and a half. It's absolutely horrific, the images right now we are getting out of Gaza. And they're attacking U.S. aircraft carriers in the region. Why? Because the U.S. is bombing Yemen and Israel is destroying Gaza. And this could all be wrapped up so quickly, so easily, if Trump just forced Israel to abide by the agreement that his negotiator, Steve Witkoff, had before he was in office. Trump really could have been the peace president. He wouldn't have to be bombing Yemen and arming and funding a genocide in Gaza, but he's choosing to do both of those things on behalf of Israel. So we now have another clip of General McKenzie. Let's play the next one.
I wouldn't take anything off the table. Again, when you take things off the table, it tends to give aid and comfort to the enemy. We've done too much of that. I think we should leave everything on the table, and I would also leave on the table actions against Tehran itself. All paths in this matter lead back to Tehran, and we need to know and understand that. They're the principal supplier for the Houthis, and right now Iran is finding it convenient to backpedal and to claim that close relationship. But in fact, the Houthis exist because of Iranian support, and now to a lesser degree because of Russian support. And we need to recognize that, and we shouldn't give Iran a free ride on this. And I think we have the capability actually right now in Iran's weakened state to threaten them very strongly.
So there's two things in this clip that I thought were really important. And the first one, this is something I've talked about time and time again, how U.S. officials will, use these slogans and they'll say, all I think about is China, and China is the biggest threat in the world, or Iran is the state sponsor of terror, or all those all roads lead to Putin, all roads lead to Iran. And essentially, it's just paranoia. Right. But these are U.S. policymakers, and they tout this paranoia as though it gives them authority, that they're the ones who actually have clarity, because they see all these threats everywhere in the world, and anything that's going on in the world that isn't in line what America wants either originates in Moscow or Pyongyang or Beijing or Tehran or Caracas. And we have to get involved in all these wars all the time. We had to fight all these conflicts. We had to constantly be, taking Iran down and taking Russia down and meddling so China has less allies and so Venezuela can't get more electricity, right? We're constantly intervening in all these cases. And another thing that he says there that's really important about U.S. foreign policy now is we can never take anything off the table. We have to constantly tell every country everywhere in the world that the United States has thousands of nuclear weapons and we could annihilate your entire country if you don't do what we want. And we say that time and time again. It's just bullying tactics, and eventually it costs you your nuclear deterrent because you're just constantly blustering about it, but it also makes every other country in the world hate you and do everything they can to not do business with you, to circumvent you. And eventually this is going to lead to increasing U.S. isolation on the world stage. But again, this is a retired general just advocating the Washington establishment foreign policy. So now we have some statements from Senator Mark Warner on Signalgate. And, this guy's a real hawk and a Democrat, so this is interesting.
Let's talk about the raid first. Are you glad this administration is taking a more aggressive military posture against the Houthis? And do you believe if it is successful, it will reopen commercial shipping through the Red Sea?
I think we should take more affirmative action. I think the administration is doing the right thing. I would rather them do it with more of our allies involved. But the fact that Donald Trump's America First is turning quickly into America Alone. But the basis of going after Houthis in a stronger, tougher way, I agree with.
So he seems to know absolutely nothing about the situation. First, right, this is a Democrat. If he wanted to back Joe Biden, if he wanted to back his party, he could say we went against the Houthis aggressively and it didn't accomplish any goals, and Donald Trump isn't doing anything new. He's killing more civilians, sure, but that's not helping anything. That's not going to achieve any goals. And then, he just is kind of going on here looking for some excuse and even sells out the former administration, which is just absolutely crazy. But this is, I guess, not to be unexpected. If you remember back to Trump's first administration, when did the press actually like and when did the bipartisan consensus actually like and support Donald Trump? When he bombed Syria. He bombed the government of Bashar al-Assad, who was fighting against jihadists, and he bombed them without congressional authorization on 2 different occasions based on lies. The Trump administration had to go and reorganize an international watchdog group on chemical weapons, had to change their charter, create new investigation teams, silence whistleblowers, all just to cover up the fact that it illegally bombed Syria. And this is the one thing that the mainstream media celebrated Donald Trump doing during his first administration on foreign policy, when he wanted to get along better with Putin. Oh, no, that's terrible. When he didn't go to direct war with Iran after he assassinated Soleimani, that he shouldn't have done that. He shouldn't have negotiated a deal with the Taliban. He shouldn't have wanted to withdraw from Syria. He shouldn't have wanted to end the war in Somalia. No, all those things were terrible, right? And so much of what he did on foreign policy during his first administration got a complete pass. And so it's so upsetting to hear senators say things like this. Now let's move on to the next clip from Senator Warner.
The administration argues the Biden administration didn't do enough. Do you agree with that?
I think the Biden administration took repeated action against the Houthis. I think they could have done more.
So again, here's the best example of him being able to defend his administration, to defend his party, attack Donald Trump, and he simply doesn't do that. Now, before we play this next clip, if anybody is listening live, go ahead and hit the repost button. If you're watching on X or Twitter, if you're on YouTube, make sure you subscribe to the channel. You could go ahead and drop us a comment in the chat. We'll throw up relevant ones on the screen, and let's go ahead and play our next clip.
One of the things discussed in this chat, which the administration has said is accurate, was a reference to a high-value Houthi target at his girlfriend's house somewhere in Yemen, probably Sana'a, near the capital. David Martin, my exceptional colleague here at CBS, has reported that the Israelis are furious about this because they believe those who would read that could sort of backward engineer that and find something out that they shouldn't find out. Do you agree with that?
So the journalist leads off this question with, the Trump administration used a foreign government to generate intelligence to bomb a civilian target. And the question isn't, how could this happen without a declaration of war from Congress? Is there going to be investigations on a war crime that was clearly committed? No, that isn't his question. His question is about, are our allies going to be able to trust us? Are we continuing to get support from Israel? We give our allies so much support. NATO exists because of the United States. Even alliance members know it's going to crumble. And so what? Are France, the UK not going to share intelligence with the US and push the United States out of NATO? No, they're going to do everything they can to keep the US in NATO. The US sent Israel $20 billion last year in military aid. Is Israel going to jeopardize that by not sending their intelligence to the United States to bomb targets that we want? And by the way, how is that not the question? is the US government taking their intelligence from foreign nations and then using our planes to bomb them, right? Like if Israel wants to bomb an apartment building in Sana'a, they shouldn't use us to do it. I mean, we're the world empire. If anything, our Middle East proxy, Israel, should be sent out to do the fighting in the region. And yet we're treated as the proxy when we're giving Israel $20 billion a year. The relationship is completely absurd and backwards. What is happening is absolutely disgusting. And there's so many sources of outrage in what happened during that Signal chat. The fact that they so flippantly talked about, again, bombing an apartment building, killing a guy who, again, they just had intelligence from the Israelis, doesn't even seem like it was confirmed. And most of the outrage in the media is over, was this or was this not classified information? Should it have been said in this Signal chat? Honestly, at this point, I'm glad it was said in the Signal chat, so we got this insight into the Trump administration, so we can understand a little bit of how the thinking goes, how the dynamics are in the Trump administration. And it's clear the voices of reason that we thought existed, J.D. Vance, is really weak. Right. I mean, he said something against it, but it's not like he was willing to argue about this. He, in his, I think this, but I defer to Pete Hegseth who wants to do it. Well, that's really not any kind of opposition. You're voicing a reason not to do it, but you're ultimately saying that you support it even if we go ahead with it. Tulsi Gabbard didn't speak out against it. And so the people who were assumed to be potential restrainers turn out to either be unwilling or now just completely agree with the policy. And so that's important for us to understand going forward, and what kind of wars that Donald Trump could get us into in the Middle East if there's nobody in his administration standing up for it. It's also really crazy. One of the things that's really crazy to me is that Mike Waltz isn't fired yet. During Trump's first administration, a blunder like this would certainly lead you to getting fired on through a Twitter post, and it would have been glorious and I would have been extremely happy. But that Trump hasn't done that is really discouraging to me in all of this. So I have one more clip to Mark Warren to play. This is him responding to the question.
I have not seen any of the classified information about this, so I'm basing my knowledge on open source. If the Israelis are this mad, and I think they got a right to be this mad, about classified information being treated sloppily, and this is a pattern. We've seen them expose CIA agents in the first 2 weeks. We've seen the Doge boys print the full budget and headcounts of a classified agency. So this is not a one-off. And what happens if the Israelis are this mad and the Five Eye partners, our key allies, are upset? Will they continue to share information with us if it's treated this sloppily? And if we don't see action taken by this administration, if someone is not held accountable, I believe Secretary Hegseth should resign or be fired. I think Mike Waltz should resign or be fired. If no action is taken, what message does that send to the workforce? Because, Major, I can tell you this. If you were a military officer or a CIA agent and you treated classified information this way, you would be fired. End of story.
So the last point he makes there is probably the only accurate thing he said in that entire interview that I sat there and watched for you guys to break down the best clips. And it is true, and it is important that if this was anybody lower ranking, they would be punished and potentially even thrown in jail. Judge Napolitano on Judging Freedom has really made, I think, a good comparison between how Mike Waltz is treated versus Jad Teixeira, who was the young airman, lived not too far from me, in fact, who was posting some secret or classified documents that he got on Discord. And he ends up getting a long jail sentence. Of course, Chelsea Manning goes to jail, Daniel Hale goes to jail, Edward Snowden is exiled to Russia. Even though a lot of the information they released was to the American people and for our benefit, this was just a blunder. This was incompetence. This was stupidity. If not, an outright, I guess, sabotage of the Trump administration. And yet this man is somehow going around telling everybody, I take responsibility, but he still has his job, and it doesn't appear that he's going to be fired. And so the real scandal though of all of this is the fact that the Trump administration did this and plotted it in this way and is waging an illegal war, and nobody cares within the Washington Beltway. All they're concerned about is, Signalgate and classified information. Should Pete Hegseth resign? All right, everybody, that will do it for the show today. Thank you all so much for tuning in. If you can, hit a share button before you go, and make sure if you're watching on YouTube, you subscribe to the channel. We'll be back with another episode soon.